One of the most gruesome hate crimes in U.S. history has been executed in Texas for the dragging death of a black man. Earlier this evening, Tashara Parker was outside of the most active execution chamber in the country, where John William King did not receive any last-minute stays of execution.
Huff Creek Road in Jasper, Texas, was never meant to be remembered. It was just another stretch of asphalt cutting through pine trees, a place where crickets sang at night and dust settled under the hum of pickup trucks. But on June 7, 1998, that quiet road became a graveyard, a stage for a murder so brutal it branded itself into America's conscience. James Byrd Jr., a 49-year-old black man, was chained by his ankles to the back of a pickup. The chain clinked as the engine roared forward, dragging him across the pavement. For 3 miles, his body was torn apart against the unforgiving asphalt. Flesh stripped away, bones shattered. Finally, his head and right arm severed when the body struck a culvert. His remains were dumped near a black cemetery, as if his killers wanted the world to know this was more than a crime. It was a message of hate. Among the 3 men who carried out the killing was John William King. Covered in racist tattoos, steeped in white supremacist ideology, King wasn't just there. He was the voice, the planner, the one who wanted Byrd's death to scream louder than bullets ever could. The dragging death of James Byrd Jr. shocked the nation. It was not an isolated murder. It was a modern lynching, carried out in broad daylight at the edge of the 21st century. Brewer would later mock Texas with his last meal. But King's defiance was different, colder. If Brewer mocked Texas with food, John William King mocked America with silence. And when the state came for him in 2019, after 2 decades of appeals and waiting, he refused even to speak, leaving behind one last insult. John William King was born in 1974 in Jasper, Texas, a place where pine trees towered over small houses, and neighbors pretended life was simple. For some kids, Jasper was safe enough. But for King, it was the kind of town where frustration grew in silence, where prejudice lived quietly in porches and dinner tables, where hate could slip into the ears of a boy before he even understood what words meant. He wasn't destined for greatness. He wasn't even destined for mediocrity. School rejected him, and he rejected it back. By the time his classmates were imagining futures, King was drifting into petty theft, vandalism, and scraps with the law. But here's the thing America hates to admit. Petty criminals are not always crushed by punishment. Some are sculpted by it. King was one of them. Arrests, courtrooms, and jail cells didn't correct him. They simply funneled him into a bigger system that pretends to rehabilitate but often manufactures something worse. Prison was supposed to teach him discipline, responsibility, reform. Instead, it fed him ideology like poison. Inside those walls, King wasn't just another inmate. He was a recruit. The Aryan Brotherhood found him, claimed him, gave him a new kind of family. Suddenly, the boy who had never belonged anywhere belonged to something dark and proud. They covered him in ink. Swastikas stamped across his flesh, lightning bolts carved in black, the Ku Klux Klan's burning cross etched into his skin like a second heartbeat. Tattoos became his armor. His body wasn't his anymore. It was a flag. Prison didn't break his hate. It hardened it into steel. Letters smuggled in from supremacist groups became his scripture. He soaked up race war propaganda like gasoline on a rag. Words like purity and cleansing weren't just theories to him. They were commands. He was no longer a dropout, no longer a petty thief. In his own mind, he had been promoted. He was a soldier, a chosen warrior for a white America he believed was under attack. And this is the most annoying part. America pretends prison is a place where broken men are fixed. Politicians sell it as a factory for redemption, a place where criminals come out reformed. But in reality, those same walls forge monsters like King. He didn't leave prison healed. He left branded, indoctrinated, sharper in his hate than ever before. The truth is brutal. Society trained him. Society made him. Society locked him away, ignored the cancer growing inside, and then unleashed him back onto Jasper's streets. And what walked out of that cell wasn't a boy anymore. It was a man with hate dripping from his skin, hate carved into his bones, hate glowing in his eyes. By the time he came back home, King wasn't just looking for trouble. He was looking for war. He had spent years preparing for it, convinced that every black man he passed on the street was an enemy, convinced that every mile of Texas soil belonged to him and men like him. This wasn't rehabilitation. It was incubation. The system didn't correct him. It weaponized him. And when John William King walked Jasper's roads again, he wasn't searching for peace. He was searching for a victim. And when he found James Byrd Jr., he found exactly that. And he would carry that hate back onto Jasper's roads. June 7, 1998. A summer night in Jasper, Texas, where the pine trees swallowed sound and headlights cut through the dark. 3 white men, Lawrence Brewer, Sean Berry, and John William King, drove through the quiet town in a pickup truck, restless, searching. For Brewer, it was a night of violence. For Berry, it was reckless company. But for King, it was more. It was an opportunity. James Byrd Jr. walked along the road, a black man simply trying to get home. He knew Jasper, knew its people, knew its dangers. When the truck pulled up beside him, he saw faces he recognized. Men from the same town. They offered him a ride. It seemed harmless. It wasn't. The trap snapped shut the moment he climbed inside. They drove him out to the back roads, to a stretch of isolation where witnesses wouldn't come. The beating began. Fists, boots, curses hurled with every blow. King's voice cut through the violence, venomous and deliberate. He spat slurs, not just to insult but to remind Byrd of the ideology fueling every strike. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't even personal. It was a statement. King wanted a message carved into flesh and asphalt, a warning to every black man who dared to walk free in Jasper. Then came the chain. Berry's truck idled as Brewer and King wrapped the heavy iron around Byrd's ankles. The metal bit into skin, cold and final. King barked orders, his voice dripping with the pride of a general preparing for battle. To him, this was more than a killing. It was theater. The truck roared forward. The chain snapped tight. Byrd was ripped off the ground, dragged face-first across the asphalt. The sound of tearing flesh and scraping bone filled the night. For 3 miles, his body was shredded, broken, destroyed, while King and Brewer laughed, feeding off the cruelty. King wasn't behind the wheel, but make no mistake, he was in control. Every slur, every sneer, every shove came from his ideology. Brewer provided muscle. Berry provided the truck. But King provided the reason. This was his script, his spectacle, his modern lynching carried out on the cracked backroads of Jasper. By the time Byrd's body struck a culvert, his head and right arm tore free. What was left of him was dumped near a black cemetery. The final insult, deliberate and cruel, a reminder that this was never just a murder. It was a racial execution staged with the symbolism of hate. When the sun rose, Jasper was no longer a quiet town. It was a wound exposed to the world. Reporters descended. Civil rights leaders called it what it was, a lynching in 1998. Outrage erupted across America. Protesters marched. Politicians scrambled. Jasper's name was dragged into history, not for its pine trees or small-town charm, but for the night hate became spectacle. And at the center of it all was John William King, who hadn't just participated. He had orchestrated. He hadn't just killed. He had tried to remind the world that white supremacy still breathed, still walked, still dragged men to their deaths. King wasn't just guilty of murder. He was guilty of making Jasper the site of a modern lynching. The trial of John William King was not just another murder case. It was a public reckoning, a stage where Jasper, Texas, was forced to stare into the mirror and see hate staring back. The courtroom was packed from wall to wall. Reporters, locals, Byrd's family, civil rights leaders. Everyone wanted to see whether justice could answer something as grotesque as dragging a man to death in 1998. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted King not as a follower but as a mastermind. They laid out the evidence. Racist manifestos found among his belongings, letters where he bragged about white supremacy, tattoos etched across his body like banners of war, swastikas burned into his skin, Klan symbols proudly displayed, lightning bolts, the coded language of hate. His body was a testimony, a billboard advertising the very ideology that killed James Byrd Jr. The jury was shown his writings, venom poured into ink. He wrote about racial purity, about cleansing the world of those he despised. These weren't drunken ramblings. They were manifestos, structured, deliberate, laced with the conviction of a man who believed he was on a mission. King hadn't just joined the Aryan Brotherhood. He had taken its creed and branded it into his life, turning it into the justification for every act of violence. And in that courtroom, as the photographs of Bird's shredded body were displayed, as the chain and the bloodied evidence were shown, King sat with the same coldness he had carried on Huff Creek Road. No tears, no apologies, no flicker of regret. His eyes stayed hard, his posture unbroken, as if he were daring the world to look away first. Across the aisle, James Bird's family sat in silence. They had to endure every detail, every slur read aloud, every photograph burned into evidence. Grief carved itself into their faces, but they didn't look away. They watched King, hoping for even a shred of remorse. It never came. The defense tried to distance him, to argue he wasn't behind the wheel, that Sean Barry had been the driver, that Brewer's hands had done the binding. But the prosecutors shredded that thin veil. King wasn't just present, he was the fuel. He was the one who demanded Bird's death be a message. He was the ideology that dragged those chains across the asphalt. The jury didn't take long. The evidence was overwhelming, the hatred undeniable. The verdict fell heavy and cold: death. For Brewer, death had come in 2011. For King, it would take longer. Texas executions moved slow, tangled in appeals and delays. And so, while the Bird family longed for closure, King sat on death row with decades left to sneer at the system. But Texas executions moved slow, and King had 2 decades left to sneer at the system.
I'm not going to leave here until he's put to sleep. And I'm against capital punishment, but what he did is way over the top. It was a modern-day lynching. James Bird was lynched. So I don't want the world to forget this here, and so that's why I'm here.
For most men, death row is a slow unraveling. Years locked in a cell, the walls pressing closer, the countdown ticking louder with every denied appeal. Some soften, some cling to religion, clutching Bibles and whispering confessions into the dark. Others break down, begging for mercy, trying to prove that even killers can change. Texas has seen it all: men who claim salvation, men who weep for forgiveness, men who face their end with trembling regret. But John William King was not most men. For 2 decades he lived in that cage, and not once did he soften. Not once did he repent. He never begged, never apologized, never sought redemption. If Carla Faye Tucker turned her death row years into a stage for salvation, King turned his into a shrine for hate. The swastikas didn't fade. The ideology didn't weaken. Behind those bars, he continued to cling to the poison that had driven him in the first place. Letters he wrote from prison echoed the same venom. Pages filled with racial slurs, supremacist fantasies, and the same twisted logic that had led him to chain James Bird Jr. to the back of a truck. It was as though time didn't move inside his cell. He stayed the same man Jasper had known in 1998, arrogant, sneering, proud of the ideology that had made him infamous. And here lies the most annoying truth of all. Texas fed him, clothed him, sheltered him, and kept him alive for 21 years. The very state he had spat on with his crimes sustained his body day after day, appeal after appeal, execution date after execution date. Taxpayer dollars kept hate alive in a 6x9 cell, waiting for the needle that always seemed just out of reach. 2 decades, enough time for mercy, enough time for remorse, enough time for even a hint of change. But King never gave it. He wore his silence like armor, and his hate like a crown. And by the time his execution date finally came, there was no possibility of redemption left. He had spent too many years refusing it. By the time his date came, even mercy was no longer on the table. By the time John William King's execution date finally arrived in April 2019, Texas had changed. Not in the way of mercy, not in the way of justice reform, but in the most petty, controversial way imaginable. 8 years earlier, Lawrence Russell Brewer, King's partner in hate, had staged his final mockery with a mountain of food he refused to eat. Brewer's uneaten feast had embarrassed the state so badly that Texas abolished the last meal tradition altogether. And so when King's Day came, there was no ritual, no indulgence, no choice. He didn't get to request fried chicken like the old-timers. He didn't get a steak, a burger, or even a slice of pie to remind him of childhood. He got the standard prison tray: a scoop of beans, a slab of processed meat, a slice of bread, and a spoonful of vegetables. Bland, ordinary, joyless. It wasn't just punishment. It was insult, a reminder that even his stomach wasn't allowed freedom anymore. Here was the bitter irony. Brewer mocked mercy by asking for everything and eating nothing. King, years later, was denied mercy altogether. One man ruined the tradition, the other paid the price. Two killers, forever tied together not just by chains and asphalt, but by the final meals that never came. Brewer's excess and King's emptiness. A twisted echo of the crime they had committed together. And yet, in its own way, it was fitting. Brewer had laughed at the idea of mercy. King didn't even get to test it. He was stripped of the last crumb of human indulgence, forced to meet death with nothing more than cafeteria scraps. The same state that had fed him, housed him, and clothed him for 2 decades now told him he wasn't even worth a final plate of choice. Some would call it justice. Others would call it cruelty. But either way, it was humiliating. The last meal had been a strange ritual of dignity, even for monsters. Texas ended it not out of compassion, but out of spite, and John William King became its proof. But while his stomach stayed empty, his silence spoke louder than food ever could. April 24, 2019. Huntsville, Texas. The sun was setting when John William King was led from his cell to the death chamber. The walk was short but heavy, the kind of final journey only death row inmates ever take. Guards flanked him on either side, their boots echoing down the corridor. King's face was calm, expressionless, his eyes fixed forward. The racist tattoos inked across his skin, swastikas, lightning bolts, the emblems of the Klan, were still visible, still unapologetic, still mocking the very idea of change. 21 years had passed since Huff Creek Road, but he carried those symbols to the grave like armor. Inside the chamber, the ritual began. The gurney waited under fluorescent lights, sterile and cold. King climbed on without resistance. The leather straps were fastened across his chest, arms, and legs. His body stretched out, his arms extended, as if crucified by the state. The silence was suffocating. On the other side of the glass, the witnesses waited. Reporters, prison officials, and most importantly, the family of James Byrd Jr. They had waited 2 decades for this moment. Some hoped for peace, some for closure, others for the impossible, an apology. What they got instead was silence. When asked if he had any final words, King declined. He refused to speak to the room, refused to look at the family of the man he had chained and dragged to his death. His silence was not humility, it was defiance. Instead, officials read a written statement King had prepared. It was cryptic, defiant, laced with the same arrogance that had followed him through 2 decades of appeals. Many found it objectionable, not because it was loud, but because it was empty, because it carried no remorse, no regret, no acknowledgement of what he had done. Even his last words, filtered through someone else's mouth, felt like an insult. The Byrd family listened. They saw a man staring at death without flinching, still holding on to the hate that had defined his life. For them, the silence was louder than any words. He had been given 21 years to change, and in the end, he gave them nothing. No closure, no apology, no humanity. At 7:08 p.m., the needle slid into his arm. The chemicals flowed, first numbing, then paralyzing, then freezing the heart. His chest rose once, fell, and did not rise again. In less than 15 minutes, John William King was pronounced dead at 44 years old. The room did not erupt in celebration. There were no cheers, no catharsis. The silence lingered. The man who had orchestrated one of America's most infamous hate crimes left the world in the same way he had lived in it. Cold, arrogant, and unrepentant. If Brewer mocked with food, King mocked with silence, proving that hate dies without apology. The execution of John William King did not close the story. It only sealed it. His death, like Brewer's before him, was not an ending but a reminder. Together, the 2 men were forever tied to James Byrd Jr., chained not just by the crime they committed but by the legacy that crime left behind. Byrd's death was not forgotten. Could not be. It became a scar that stretched far beyond Jasper, far beyond Texas, far beyond the dirt road where the chain clinked and the truck roared. It was a national reckoning, a public reminder that racism was not some relic of the 1960s, not some ghost locked away in history books. It was alive, breathing, and willing to kill. In 2009, more than a decade after Byrd's body was dragged across asphalt, Congress passed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. It was legislation born out of blood, Shepherd murdered in Wyoming for being gay, Bird murdered in Texas for being black. Their names became permanent fixtures in American law, symbols of what happens when hate is allowed to fester. And while Bird's name carried dignity, King and Brewer's names carried filth. Jasper, the quiet little town tucked among pine trees, will never escape the shadow. To outsiders, it is no longer just Jasper. It is the place where a black man was dragged to death by white supremacists in 1998. It is the site of a modern lynching, a town branded forever by an act it did not commit but cannot erase. For its citizens, life was split into two eras, before Bird's death and after. And here is the annoying truth. Brewer and King are not remembered as men. They are remembered as stains. And yet, their names remain etched in history because of the hate they carried to the grave. They were not great thinkers, not leaders, not revolutionaries. They were failures, a dropout, a petty criminal, a prison radical. And still, their hatred was so raw, so violent, that it reshaped American law and scarred a nation. That is their legacy. Not repentance. Not change. Not humanity. Hate, preserved like rot, handed down as a warning to everyone who hears James Byrd Jr.'s name. But history doesn't just remember the dead. It asks what the living will do with the lesson. James Byrd Jr. never chose to be a martyr. He was simply walking home that night in Jasper, a man with children, friends, a family who loved him. But when the chain wrapped around his ankles, when the truck pulled him into the dark, his death became something larger than himself. He became the face of America's ugliest truth, that hate still breathes, still kills, still laughs in the silence of the night. Brewer and King never chose to be symbols either. Yet they became the opposite of Byrd, not martyrs but monuments of cruelty. Brewer mocked mercy with his uneaten feast. King mocked humanity with his silence. Neither gave an apology. Neither sought forgiveness. Neither softened. They went to their deaths unrepentant, carrying their hate like armor to the grave. Two deaths, so different, bound by the same crime. James Byrd Jr. died begging for life, torn apart by men who saw him as less than human. John William King died strapped to a gurney, refusing even to speak, refusing even to grant words to the family that had waited 2 decades for them. One died as a victim of hate. The other died as hate itself. And yet, their shadows remain. The road in Jasper still carries the memory. The law still carries Bird's name. The legacy of Brewer and King still poisons the air when people whisper about hate crimes in America. If punishment brings justice, why do their shadows still haunt us? And if redemption is possible, why did King choose silence instead of truth? Because the truth is simple and unbearable. King is gone. Brewer is gone. Byrd is gone. But hate remains. Hate does not need chains or trucks. It does not need tattoos or written manifestos. It waits in silence, in prejudice, in politics, in streets where men still walk vulnerable in the wrong skin. And hate, not the needle, is the real executioner America still hasn't stopped.